Hey there, let's continue our look at ecology, and we're going to focus here on community level biology, looking at what happens as two different species interact. We'll consider invasive species, why they're so harmful, what a population is, and the one that's actually making the most impact right now. Here I am, how you doing? Let's get started looking at uh, interactions between species. We're not going to dwell on the definition of species right now. It's used a little broadly here. You can think of populations might be the better term rather. So interactions between species or between populations. Interactions here can be anything. They can be where they're both going for the same resource, or they're both trying to um, one is trying to eat the other one, or one is being eaten by the other one. So we can look at interactions a couple of different ways. We'll give them a classification here. And again, it's helpful to think about this. It's helpful to think about this term niche. Niche is an organism's role in the environment, kind of what it does. So when we use the term niche, we're referring to the organism's job. It is a predator, or it is a prey item, or it is a producer, or it's a consumer. Kind of what role does it fall under in an ecosystem? So you'll see why that's important as we look at some examples. All I want to show you here is the classifications. Competition is a negative interaction. That means when two different populations, here's population one, here's population two, interact in a competitive way. Let's say they're going for the same food source or the same shelter. They're both going to suffer some for that. They're going to lose some resource as they compete with each other. Mutualism is a positive negative relationship. I'm sorry, positive positive. That is, one species benefits as does the other. We'll consider an example. Predation is where one benefits and one does not. This one's easy to understand. The predator wins, it's going to benefit, it's going to get food. The prey is going to be the food. So that's not a positive interaction for the prey. Herbivory is when a plant eats, sorry, not a plant, but an animal eats a plant. So the animal benefits because the animal clearly is going to be getting the food source from the plant, and the plant's going to lose. Parasitism and pathogens. This is where you have a parasite, let's say a microorganism, a bacteria, that actually is going to be getting a resource from the host, and the host is going to lose resources in the process. We'll look at some examples. Probably the strangest one, the one you may not have heard of, is commensalism, where one species clearly benefits and the other one is not really hurt at all, not really helped at all. Let me give you an example of this and before we look at the other ones. If you consider the birds building a nest in a tree, okay, the birds benefit. They are sheltered, they are protected, they get to live in a high area away from ground predators. So the birds have a benefit. They are population one, they are receiving a benefit. The tree could care less. The tree is not being helped or hurt by birds living there. So the tree really has sort of a neutral interaction in this case. So commensalism is going to be where one benefits, in this case the bird, and the tree doesn't care one way or the other, not helped or hurt. So let's look at some other examples of these. We'll spend more time in class on competition, and I'll give you an example that makes this all makes perfect sense. Now it's going to seem a little odd because when you think about two species competing, you don't think about one of them being harmed and the other one being harmed. You think one of them wins. Well, even a winner loses resources. And this idea that you can have two species in the same area, in the same niche competing, is called the competitive exclusion principle. Essentially, you can't have two species that are very similar doing the exact same thing in the exact same area, going for the exact same resource. It just can't be sustained. Eventually, one of them is going to be eliminated, and that's the idea of competitive exclusion. Maybe if you have two species of birds and they're going for the same seed type, eventually one of them is just a better competitor than the other one, and the one type is going to be locally eliminated. That's the idea of competitive exclusion. What you're seeing here is this idea of what's called interspecies competition. These are both going for the same resource. This bear and this chipmunk are going for acorns. So interspecies means between species competition. Now, these two are not too similar, so they can both coexist. But if you had two species of chipmunks that are very, very similar, going for the exact same resource at the exact same time, eventually one of them is going to be eliminated. But even the winner loses resources because it had to compete with the first type. And again, I have an example in class that'll make this make perfect sense to you. Promise. Okay, mutualism is when both species benefit by their interaction. Classic example is when you talk about pollinators, the insect pollinators and the plants who pollinate. This bee here is going to get nectar from the flower. It's food for bees. Bees benefit. How does the flower benefit? When the bee lands on it, it's going to pick up pollen on its hairy chest here. It's going to pick up the pollen and transfer it from one flower to the next. And so the flower benefits because it has a pollination system, part of its reproductive system, if you will. So here you have a clear example of a positive and positive interaction. Some interactions, as we said, are going to benefit one and be harmful to the other. Predation is a good example of that. Here is, I'm going to preview this, I'm going to spoil the ending. That's the winner, and that's the eventual loser. Okay, so that's clearly it's going to be a positive, negative interaction where that one benefits and that one is harmed. Herbivory is when you have an animal eating a plant and taking the plant's resources. So it's kind of like predation in a way, where you have one that benefits and one that's harmed. Parasites and pathogens are much the same way. A parasite may be living on or in a host and is going to get resources from the host and take resources from the host and benefit. The host loses resources as part of the process. Pathogens are going to be things like microorganisms or fungi that can actually live in or on a host and do the same thing. They're going to take resources. These tend to be disease causing though, so they may harm the host ultimately. So what's the difference between a parasite, and we'll go back for a second, and a predator? The biggest difference here is usually the size. The predator is usually going to be bigger or as big as the prey, and is going to kill the prey item on purpose. Parasites try not to kill in most cases because if they kill their host, then they run out of food, they run out of resource. So parasites like a tapeworm may be growing inside somebody for a long time and not kill the host, where this interaction is not going to be long term. This is going to be short term. Invasive species should be mentioned here because an invasive species is a species that comes from a different area, but when it arrives in a new area, tends to be quite disruptive. Invasive species are natural species and they belong somewhere else, where they have their own natural interactions and they have predators and they're part of an ecosystem. But if they're brought from one place to another, they tend to be quite disruptive. And we'll mention some examples. Some will be familiar to you. Lionfish were introduced into the Caribbean from Asia, and when they came in, they tend to be very aggressive predators, and they upset some of those natural interactions that had already existed in the Caribbean before the lionfish got there. In other words, invasive means to come into an area and kind of take over, kind of do a lot of damage and disrupt the natural relationships that existed. This here is something familiar to me. This is gypsy moth. Gypsy moth is an invasive species from Europe. It was brought to the United States intentionally for silk purposes, but when it escaped, it actually these caterpillars can come through and do huge damage to our hardwood forest in the United States. So if you've already seen the connection here, lionfish were in Asia, came to the U.S., they were brought, well, to the Caribbean, they were brought here. Gypsy moth were brought here. Sometimes the species are brought intentionally and sometimes they're brought accidentally, but invasive species tend to be quite disruptive. Here's some more examples, and hang on. Here's another example. Burmese pythons were set loose in Florida. People would get these pythons, raise them, and then they get to eat too much and then let them go. Well, the pythons began to take over and do a lot of damage, eating a lot of the prey items that were normally prey for other species that lived in the Everglades. Kudzu, we're all familiar with. Kudzu is an invasive species. It was brought from Japan to control erosion whenever we'd cut roads. And now it's climbing all over, and the term it's used is kudzu is the vine that ate the South. It finds the southern part of the United States very easy to grow in, and it grows a lot faster than our native species, therefore taking them over and out competing some of our native plants for resources. How do we control these? Excuse me. How do we control invasive species? Biologists tend to like to bring in what's called biological control or biocontrol mechanisms. That is, if you have, in the case of gypsy moth, it's a good example, if you bring in the natural birds that would eat them from Europe into the United States, then perhaps that will control the gypsy moth. But as you've already probably figured out, you better be careful, because when you bring in another species like the birds, they're also going to change the interactions you're going to have in an area. So biocontrol is a pretty controversial, it can be effective in some areas, but whenever we introduce a new species, we're not going to be 100% sure what it's going to do when it gets here. Let me end with just this thought here about populations, because we will mention populations in class as we go through our next study here. Populations are really important to ecologists because they're going to vary in terms of their number, their dispersion, how dense they are, what's called survivorship curves. We care about a lot of parts about populations because as populations grow or shrink, that affects other interactions in an ecosystem. So we're going to talk about how we measure populations, why it's important to do it, and in particular, we're going to focus on this population, humans. Right now, our population of humans is about 7.2 billion people. And just to write that out for you, that's 7, oops, I'm getting my commas wrong places here. At 7.2 billion. So 7.2 billion is a lot of people. Sorry, I got my commas in the wrong place. Let me fix it. Just to give you an idea, we add 100 million people to our planet each year. And so that has a huge consequence on the interactions that we were talking about, our ecosystem interactions. And we'll talk about those more in class. See you there.